Welcome to another episode of the Journey Podcast. The Journey Podcast is all about sharing the journeys of purpose-driven leaders from all walks of life who are following their passion and fulfilling the purpose in their own unique way. And I'm your host, Risa Kawamoto, and my pronouns are she and her. In today's episode, I'm having a conversation with Ronak Jasum, a yoga teacher with a background in community engagement and participation. She is passionate about creating inclusive spaces for women and linking up her practice with other passions such as spirituality, mysticism, justice, and nature. So Ronak is my lovely colleague, and I first met Ronak when she started joining my yoga classes online during the pandemic. And I got to know her more in the past couple of years as she went on to become a yoga teacher herself. In this episode, she shares how she grew up in a religious household, how she was very intentional with traveling, her yoga and spiritual journey, and her passion for teaching yoga and creating inclusive spaces for women. I hope you find her journey inspiring. Enjoy! Hi Ronak, welcome to the Journey Podcast. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today and hear your journey. Just before we begin our conversation, I just wanted to check in how you're feeling today and also where you're joining from.
Hi Risa, thanks for having me on. So my name's Ronak and I am based in London. And I am very well, thank you. I'm currently working from home. Well, this morning I was working from home, and it's just been a nice, quiet, relatively productive morning.
So I would love to first for you to share a little bit about your background and anything you like to share about growing up and your early years.
In terms of my earliest memories, I grew up in Manchester. With my parents and my older brother. And it was a relatively simple, modest upbringing. You know, I had a relatively good education. My parents were very, passionate about making sure that me and my brother had a good education. We had a good start to life. I was very involved in the Iraqi Muslim community. So there's a big Iraqi community in the UK. And so I was surrounded by, family, community, lots of kind of events and things happening. But actually, in the most recent years, I've done a lot of reflecting about my early years and growing up. And actually, I'm very conscious that I actually wasn't born in the UK. I was born in France, and I only lived there for 2 years. and so actually, I don't really remember very much about those years. But I think they really did define my parents' experiences and my experiences, and I think they're a really fundamental part of my story. And so the reason that we were in France is because my dad was studying his PhD, so he was there as an international student, and me and my brother were born there. And then when he finished his PhD, instead of going back to Iraq, they made the decision to move to the UK because my auntie was living here in Manchester, because at the time there were heavy sanctions in Iraq. So, there was a lack of food in Iraq. Sadly, I think millions of people died as a result of these sanctions. And so my parents had to make that decision to immigrate elsewhere. And so, we all moved over to the UK. And I think in my early years, my parents made a lot of sacrifices. And when I was a child, actually, it's incredible. Like I look back and I think I didn't realize they made those sacrifices. As modest as our life was, I didn't realize that we were lacking anything. But I think my parents worked so hard to get, food on the table, to make sure, like I say, we had a good education. And so I just think that kind of sacrifice and that love and that, I guess that cushioning from my brother is just like, it's incredible, really. And I think it's definitely worth highlighting that. Yeah, and I guess it's interesting because it's really inspiring for me, but kind of in my later years. I guess another part of my upbringing is that my parents are they're Muslim and they're people of faith. And so I was raised in a religious household. And so obviously I picked up a lot of the traditions and the religious practices. And one of the things that I got taught very early on, like a lot of Muslims, is the 5 daily Islamic prayers, maybe as like a preteen. And at the time, you just kind of go along with it and you pray, and it might not make, it didn't make, full sense, but, it just kind of was something that you did. It wasn't always easy, as I'm sure a lot of people can maybe relate to. As children, you want to go and play instead of praying. I mean, it is only like 5 minutes or so to pray, but it's one of those things. But actually, one thing, again, just on reflection, is that there's one thing about those sorts of practices that you do that really, again, shape how you live your life, and in terms of so it requires a lot of discipline. And when you're able to pray 5 times a day, for most of your life, and do things like fasting, you start to realize actually, that you start to realize personally that you're very capable of doing a lot of things if you have that discipline. And so I think I'm really, really blessed to have grown up in that household for that particular reason. It's just that kind of that discipline and that practice. So there's obviously that positive. There's a positive. That's one positive of sort of the prayer and the discipline. But obviously there's also the, I've been on a journey of spirituality and faith, and of course it's a fundamental part of my day now, prayer. Yeah, I guess that's a really big blessing, and it's a big part of my identity and my story.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing that, and also your reflection as well. There was quite a lot there, and I'm just taking it all in at the moment. I was kind of picking up a few things from there that I love that you shared reflection on kind of the positive side of how you grew up and your childhood experience. I know you mentioned your parents had to make sacrifices to make sure that you and your brothers provided for, and to make sure you get good education. And I think you mentioned like that kind of impacted your, is it adult life or like later in your life? Can you share a little bit more about that, if that's okay with you?
Yeah, sure. That's an interesting question. So there's something about, on your journey of adulthood, you try and sort of figure out what's important in life and what your priorities are. And I think a lot of us go through that path of thinking, okay, I need to earn my money and I need to get on the career ladder, and that's the way we succeed in life. And then when you kind of look back and you think, actually, I lived in a very, loving environment and had a lot of things, and it definitely wasn't sort of financial or material. And so it makes you sort of think, actually, do I really need all of that material stuff and all that money, when in actual fact I was able to thrive because I had the right people around me and I had that right environment and that right love, I suppose.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It sounded like you learned a lot from your parents, and yeah, I love how you kind of took that in a way that makes sense to you and in a positive way of living. So thank you so much for sharing that. And another thing that you mentioned was discipline, from pray, like doing, is it five times a day? And that kind of taught you discipline when it comes to fasting, for example. How was that discipline taught you in your adult life, and how did that impact you as you were navigating your adult life?
Yeah, I guess in your adult life, you pick up these kind of practices, or you're told to do certain things or whatever else in whatever context. And at the time it might feel like a massive inconvenience, like why should I be doing this instead of hanging out with my friends or doing whatever else. Well, later down the line, when you do sort of that self-discovery work, now in modern times you have so many books about things, but there's that thing around people always talk about habits and like how building up habits, I think it's something like 30 days can support you to adopt something for life or whatever else. So you kind of read about these things and there's lots of theories and there's lots of things, but actually, I mean, I didn't know that when I was growing up, but like when you read about that, it kind of validates actually, yeah, like you have to kind of intentionally build up those habits, even if they're difficult, for a certain amount of time in order for it to actually be integrated into your life. Yeah, and there's something as well, I can't remember where I've read this. I've read a lot of books, but I can never remember my references. But there's something about a lot of the time we think that we rely on motivation in order to do things, when in actual fact, motivation is not a sustainable way to build up a habit. So, for example, if you think of an athlete who wants to like be the world's fastest runner, for example, they have to practice every single day of their life, really religiously for like 5 hours a day, and they follow this like really difficult diet plan and whatever else. And like if they relied on motivation, then like if they woke up in the morning and thought, oh, I'm not feeling motivated today, I'm not going to do it, then they relied on that motivation, they wouldn't have achieved what they would have achieved. But because they relied on habit and that discipline, a lot of athletes or people who are successful in their field achieve what they do. So I think for me, it's like that realization that actually being motivated isn't going to get you very far. Relying on motivation, I mean, motivation is important, but relying on motivation isn't going to get you very far. Actually, discipline and following through, and like even with prayer, I think any Muslim would tell you, or any person of faith will tell you that the certain days you wake up, or there's a certain, it's a set time, and it's the call for prayer, and you're like, I'm not feeling motivated right now. But you get on your prayer anyway, and you follow the motions, and like you might not even feel it fully spiritually, but maybe, you will benefit somehow, even if it's just like a tiny bit. And it's like, as long as you've got yourself out there and you've just taken that first foot forward and just followed through with your original plan, then in the long term, it will kind of benefit you.
Thank you. I love what you just shared, and that is so true. Like, relying on motivation isn't the only way to, or it's not the most productive way, I guess, to following through habits and things. I used to be so good at doing morning yoga practice, and now like, I really can't wake up in the morning earlier enough to fit squeeze my morning practice in. I'm trying to get back into it, but it's just so challenging. I don't know why.
I know the feeling, trust me.
Yeah,
I know the feeling. We're only human, like, nobody's perfect. We're only human.
That's what I'm trying to tell myself, but I just feel a bit lazy, and like, no, it's okay, but then I feel guilty for not doing it, and like, how can I call myself a yoga teacher if I'm not doing morning practice, and all that things comes up. But thank you so much for sharing that. And when you were growing up, did you have any interest, or did you have anything that you were really passionate about?
I guess there were a few things, because it might sound a bit unusual, but from a very, very young age, what's been embedded in my DNA is like, I've always been just really passionate about feminism, women's rights, human rights, justice. Until this day, it's just like any injustice boils my blood. But I just remember like early on in my like childhood, like it's me and my brother. So just in terms of like a traditional Iraqi sort of household, my mum would sort of tell me to join her in the kitchen and help her, and I'd be like, well, no, my brother's not doing it, so why should I be doing it? And so that from very, very early on, I remember I was like a very young teen, and I'd be like, no, I'm not going to do it. So I think from very early on, and that's not the only reason, that I've been very passionate feminist or into sort of human rights, and I wouldn't say that that's the most important, it's not the kind of the biggest priority in the world, but it's I guess from a very, very young age, I just kind of felt that energy. And I think with anything I do, it always sort of links back to justice and equality, and it's sort of embedded into everything I do. I think another thing on a slightly different note is I've always been into sports. I've always been playing football as a child. I used to play with my brother. I used to play in school, and I just love that. I guess I have a naturally competitive spirit, but I also love the kind of team sports in general. And I think I've always loved that, being around people and community side of things. And again, like the different phases of like playing football, it's always been part of a community. And it's, I think it's a kind of really shaped, or it's always been a part of my journey, that kind of thing with football. And I think there's something as well about football and like playing sports. I'm not sure if you're into kind of any sports in particular, but there's something about sports that when you're playing it and you're just kind of so immersed in it and you're so present. And I think, again, it's only after I've sort of been doing yoga and things, it's like, you're like, oh, okay, this is how it feels to be present. And you reflect and you're like, that's why I enjoyed football, because I was so present and like just in the moment. So there's something about that as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I've never really been a sport person growing up, and no, yeah, even now, like I'm not, I'm also really competitive, so like I relate
Okay.
to you on that. But yeah, I've never played in a competitive like sport or anything like that growing up. But I love what you just said, which I never really thought the connection between like, and I guess it might be with any kind of sport or competitive sport, but yeah, like being present when you're playing football and yeah, and then yoga, like it'll help you get in touch with present moment, I guess, by practicing yoga. So like I love that connection you made.
It was a recent kind of reflection, to be honest.
Mm,
It's not something I really thought about when I used to play it, but
great, thank you. So you were interested in, well, you were really passionate about justice and feminism, and then you also loved playing football and and you kind of also mentioned that I guess one of the reasons you like playing football is the feel of that connection with other people and feel of that community element. How did you navigate your kind of your teenage years through to college, university, if you did go to university, and into kind of your early career?
it always surprises people actually. But in my kind of high school years, I did a GCSE in business, and I think I owe it to my teacher, but like I really enjoyed it. I just found it really interesting. So I actually studied business management with marketing, and yeah, I enjoyed it. It was quite interesting. And there were kind of different modules. There was things around sort of social marketing and not-for-profit marketing, and yeah, I kind of did that degree. And when I graduated, I wasn't quite sure which direction to go in. And what I would say is that I describe it as a quarter life crisis. In my early 20s, I'd sort of graduated and I was working these odd jobs and I was just like, what am I going to do with my life? And I was surrounded by people. So the people in my community went down very vocational career paths. So, I
Mm.
had friends and family who were pharmacists and dentists and doctors and engineers or whatever else. And like, so their path was very clear. Whereas with me, it was like I did
Mm.
this quite open degree. And I just didn't have that path. So I sort of had this midlife crisis and well, quarter life crisis, I guess, I was in my early 20s. But and so there were lots of questions about, and this, your whole life you're sort of told if you get good grades, which I did, you're going to be set on this path. But actually you realize when you enter adulthood, you're like, oh my God, no, that doesn't happen automatically. So yeah, there was lots of umming and ahhing. And then I sort of saw students from my course going into like these big corporations. And I think very, very early on, I was like, I can't, like, I remember filling out an application form for some, I think it was Nestle, and it said, like, why would you like to work for us? And I was like, I don't want to work for you. You're like, it's an exploitative company and you're awful. Like, why the hell would I want to work for you? And like, so at that point, I was like, you know what? I can't do it. I can't work for these big corporations. And so then I got a place on a graduate scheme working in local government, which gave me the opportunity to go on like these 6-month placements around the organisation. And that's when I moved to London from Manchester. And I was kind of, yeah, working these different roles. And I guess it was interesting as I was exposed to different teams. And yeah, I guess it was kind of like I was going into a path that was a bit more, contributing. It felt like I was contributing more to society and it felt a bit more ethical. Still trying to figure things out. And like, I guess there's that journey as well of, I think we're all quite guilty of it, is that we define our worth and ourselves by our jobs. And it was that journey of like, oh my God, if I've not got this good job, like who am I? And it's only until recently that I kind of questioned that and really came to terms with that kind of understanding of self-worth. So at that time, I went on this graduate scheme, trial and error, etc. Most people around me were sat behind a computer, and I didn't like that. I was like, I can't sit behind a computer for the rest of my life. This is not healthy. It's not natural. I find it really depressing. As I said, I like working with people. There was elements of working with people, but just wasn't quite enough. And towards the end of my 2-year graduate scheme, I ended up in a community facing role. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. Like serving communities. Okay, this feels right. And like it was great because you got to work at your desk for a bit, but actually you got to go out a lot of the time and connect with people and people from so many different walks of life and people doing incredible things like serving their communities and responding to some really serious issues. And yeah, that's when I was like inspired. I was like, okay, this is the path that I want to do, and I want to focus on working with communities. Yeah, and that's kind of 9 to 5 job at the moment. You know, it's got its pros and cons like any job. I recently trained to become a yoga instructor. So that's something I'm also doing alongside my 9 to 5 job, which is where I'm sort of looking to kind of put more energy into and focus on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, I love to hear more on yoga. I'm curious, because I don't think I've asked you this before. So how long have you been practicing yoga, and what made you want to become a teacher?
Actually, yeah, going back to my younger years, so I was in college and they told us that there were going to be some free yoga classes. And I guess that was over 10 years ago when yoga wasn't really like a trendy or whatever else. And I was like, oh, let me give this yoga class a try. I went with a friend and I just remember we just found it so funny. It was just like a really, when you first go to yoga and you're like, what are these silly moves, and you're young as well and you find everything funny. So yeah, anyway, we rocked up to these yoga classes. Yeah, and my friend would join me occasionally, but I was there religiously. I would go every single week. And sometimes I was the only person turning up, because imagine everyone's like 16, 17 years old. So I was the only one turning up to this class, and I absolutely loved the instructor. I'd never tried any other yoga instructor, any other class. So yeah, I'd rock up every single week without fail. And then, yeah, I loved it, and I couldn't put my finger on what it was. It just made me feel so good. And then when I came out of college, I would go to that yoga instructor's like private classes.
Mm-hmm.
And she'd always give me a discount because I was just like a loyal young yoga student. And so, yeah, it's something I've done maybe for over 13 years or so. And not like really like strictly or religiously or whatever else, but it was just like I'd go once a week and I'd go and it made me feel good. And the weeks that I didn't go, I just felt like tension in my body, and I was like, oh my God, this week I've forgotten to breathe. And so I could just feel the difference when I didn't do it. And I was like, it would just, the thing is I'd go to these classes and I'd look around and people didn't look like me. You had a very particular type of person, like people who maybe were white or like young, and yeah, they didn't look like me. And so I was very conscious that people didn't have exposure to yoga and they didn't experience the beauty of it and whatever else. I had the kind of, I thought, oh, wouldn't it be amazing to be a yoga teacher? And I kind of parked that idea for many years because I just never saw it as like a realistic path for me. And then more recently, I was planning some travels, and then it kind of clicked for me. I was like, oh, I'm traveling to the region where yoga teacher training is really well known. Like, oh, let me look into these courses. And it wasn't honestly something that I actively sought out. It was just something that I kind of landed on. And when I identified the teacher training course in a particular area, when I connected with the teacher that I spoke to, I was like, okay, I'm gonna go for it. And yeah, it was a life-changing experience because I started to understand why I was feeling so good after yoga. Yoga isn't just a physical practice, as you know. It's like a holistic practice. And it's just got so many dimensions to it. And I was like, oh, this is the philosophy behind it. That's why I feel the way I do. Oh, this is the breathing plays into it and the meditation and all of that together. And so it just kind of clicked for me. And like the teacher was like so inspiring, and I was blown away by like her method. And so for me, after that, I was just like, well, going into it, I wasn't quite sure what I'd do with the course. I thought it would be nice to teach, but I wasn't quite sure. But when I connected with it on even a deeper level, I was like, okay, I need to share this with people, especially because when I was traveling, my pursuit was very much a spiritual one. Mm-hmm. So I was kind of going out there with like these really spiritual intentions. And so that deepened my spiritual practice. And like, I'm so blessed. I feel so blessed because of that. And because I am Muslim and I'm really passionate about supporting people to deepen their spiritual practice. And that, yeah, just within those 30 days of the course, I deepened my spiritual practice. And interestingly, the woman who was teaching it, coincidentally, it wasn't planned. She was a Muslim woman. And like, so we connected on such a special level because she was like, it deepened my practice. And I was like, yeah, I can see why. And we'd go to the prayer room, because it was Indonesia, there was a prayer room. Go to the prayer room and she'd pray right next to me. And I was like, in my whole life, I've never prayed next to my yoga instructor. And it was just like such a special connection. So yeah, that was really special. And yeah. I guess.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds very special. And you mentioned yoga instructor you met when you're younger, and you went to the private class and you kind of look around and like, no one looked like yourself. And then, from that to doing your yoga teacher training with a yoga instructor who is Muslim and prayed with you is just such a lovely kind of path. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I know you talked a bit already, but you took sabbatical, and that's when you went traveling and did your yoga teacher training as well. How did you find your break traveling around, and what have you learned from it, and what change did you make when you came back to London and going back to your normal life?
Yeah, God, so much. It was, well, it was post-COVID. So I think as a lot of people sort of experience, everyone sort of thought, life is too short. A lot of people made some big decisions. So for me, I wasn't sort of very mentally, in terms of mental health and spiritually, and in a lot of other ways, I wasn't feeling particularly happy. And so it got to the point where I was like, you know what? I've always wanted to take 12 months out to travel, but also to pursue things I've never had the time to do. So I was like, this is the time. And I was like, I'm young, I've not got any kind of dependence or responsibilities outside of myself. I was like, so this is the moment. So yeah, it was yeah, I took that opportunity because thankfully my workplace has that policy that supports it. My manager was really supportive. I think one of the biggest things is before I set out, I set some very, very clear intentions, and I was very fortunate enough to have access to a life coach. And actually this life coach was free because at the time I was under 30 and there's this amazing charity that does life. And so life coaching, and that was such a blessing because she helped me set out my intentions. And so I was very clear about well, not very clear, but I knew the kind of direction I wanted to go. And it was a spiritual pursuit. I wanted to feel a certain way. I wanted to sort of search for my truth. I think one of the biggest learnings for me was, I think the thing about, we all define ourselves by our jobs and by our belongings and how we look and by our community and our families. And so this was an opportunity for me to remove those layers. I was stepping away from my family. I was stepping away from my community. I had two stints of my trip of traveling, but I've traveled very lightly, and I love my clothes and I love my belongings. I love my comforts, don't we all? So it was kind of like just that removal, and even like because had my job on pause for 12 months. No, and when I was traveling, no one cared about what I did really. So you kind of strip yourself away from all of those things. And then I think for me, that was my biggest learning, is like, I am not defined by all of those things. And like, obviously I'm Muslim, but also because I've grown up in sort of certain communities or whatever, you pick up certain practices and you think sometimes your beliefs are your own, but then you start to strip things away and you're like, actually, is that what I really believe, or is that how I really want to practice, or whatever else? So for me, that was such a big blessing. I think that was a big thing. And then another thing was every single day of whether it was my trip or my pursuits, I was stepping out of my comfort zone. And for me, the biggest lesson is growth only happens when you step out your comfort zone. And we are all so comfortable. I mean, I'm speaking about myself as well. We're so comfortable in our jobs and the way we do things. But like, I grew so much because, I mean, sometimes voluntarily I stepped out my comfort zone, sometimes it's involuntary, and sometimes I was taking risks or whatever. But it was like that so much growth happened, and I was like, that is phenomenal. Like, if I could do that in 1 year, like, what can you do in your life if you push yourself out your comfort zone? So yeah, I mean, so that was, I think, a really, really big takeaway. So I think, and then one of the intentions I set out originally was about spending more time in nature, because most of my travels were in Southeast Asia, and like the culture there is to spend time outdoors. You just see like families and communities just sit outdoors most of the day. Their default is outside, whereas our default is just to be inside all the time. And like for me, that was a really big part of my spiritual experience, is like being in nature and observing like God's creation. And like, yeah, even in Islam, you might hear about Islamic prayer, but actually it's known as a form of worship to sit in nature in Islam. Like a lot of people don't know this, but actually just sitting in nature is considered a form of worship and like meditating in nature. So for me, that was like so beautiful because naturally those communities did that. So anyway, so when I came back, I guess also in that part of the world, community is a big community and family is a big part of
Mm.
like life. And then obviously London is very kind of individualistic, or I guess Western society generally. So for me, I came back and I was like, oh my God, what's important in life is community, and it's being outdoor in natures and touching the earth, and so I was I'm coming back to London, like how do I implement all these things? So I was again very intentional when I came back here. I was like I set some goals about like how I'd want to change my life, and one of them
Mm.
was because I did used to get involved in community before the sabbatical in London, but I think in London you have to be very proactive when it comes to community. And so like my intention was to invest more in like finding my people, finding my community and going to events and building relationships to form communities. And so that was a very intentional thing. And it's like an ongoing journey. And then also spending more time in nature. It's very hard. Like I joined, so one of the things I did was I joined a beautiful community garden in East London. And so at least once a week I can go out there, touch the earth,
Mm.
connect with like plants and oh God, it's just incredible. So any kind of opportunity I get to be outdoors is I try to do that. So yeah, so it's an ongoing journey, but I think the key theme around this is all like intentionality, like being intentional where you can.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, I've never really, and I don't know if this is what other people do, but like I've never heard like people seeking out like life coaching before they go big traveling or be so intentional. I don't know if this is just my impression maybe, but like people go out traveling like be really spontaneous and not knowing where they're going. And yeah, I thought that's kind of like the way to go. But like now I'm hearing like be intentional with your traveling, and yeah, that sounds a lot more intentional, I guess. Yeah, as you said.
Mm.
And
Just a point on that
mm,
actually.
mm,
So as much as my life coach helped me set intentions, it was actually still a very spontaneous trip in that I didn't make a lot of plans, but
mm,
actually her focus was very much about not necessarily what I was doing, but how I wanted to feel. It was
mm,
always like, how do you want to feel at the end in 3 months? How do you want to feel?
yeah.
And so it meant you had like a direction, and you had actually a measure, so you can actually measure, like, if you're going on the right track. Whereas if, yeah, a lot of the time, and I could have done this if I didn't have this opportunity, you just kind of go out there and you're like, actually, what am I doing and what am I looking for? And so, yeah, it was kind of like a great balance in terms of that
Mm,
intentionality, but also that spontaneity between
mm,
it.
mm. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I love what you said about like intention was more around not the kind of goals or like Western maybe
Yeah,
definition of like I know some
exactly.
people might use it intention, but like it's not goal or like specific achievements that you wanna like in tangible thing. It's more about intangible thing, like how you wanna feel. And yeah, I love that, and amazing how you kind of go about traveling and balancing that intentionality and spontaneity. And it sounds like you learned a lot from that, and then you made changes when you came back to London. And I want to get onto the community side because I know you now teach yoga to your local community, I believe. So I would love for you to share a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I came back, as it was a sabbatical, I came back to my job, but I was really keen from the get-go to start teaching yoga. So I set up some classes in East London, just one evening, a week. And my intention was always to make any kind of classes that I contribute to, inclusive, because as I said, when I first started to do yoga, it was completely free and like the style was quite inclusive. And I think the people who probably need it most are the people who probably can't afford it, or they don't, there's certain types of, there's certain segments of the community who might not feel included in this kind of traditional spaces like in studios. So that was kind of like my really first intention was like, how can I make it inclusive? given I'm Muslim, I tend to teach ladies only classes, so it's, ladies only class. But yeah, inclusivity was always kind of the key thing there. And it's a learning journey, like you're constantly learning how to make classes more inclusive. But the price point, has always been inclusive in that, like, if people are unwaged or are on lower income, they still have the option of attending, hopefully. So yeah, I've basically been teaching those classes, and it's the first time I do something like this. For someone who studied business, I've never really worked for myself. So it's been like quite a journey. It's been 6, 7, 8 months, something like that, since I've started teaching. Yeah, and it's just been a learning journey, and I've absolutely loved it. And it's not been easy, and I'm still trying to build up numbers. But I think it's incredible. I mean, it's a very small class, but there've been some really lovely, loyal students. And for me, yoga is very much about, yes, it's about the physical practice. Yes, it's about the breathing and the meditation, but it's actually, for me, it's an absolute privilege to create a space where people can come together, carve some time out for themselves and just like connect inwards. And I think that for me, it's about the space, like creating that space. And again, it's a learning journey, but I just feel it feels like an absolute privilege to create that space. So yeah, that's kind of a bit of an introduction to my teaching. And more recently, I was invited by a friend to teach at a retreat in Devon, which was absolutely incredible. It was a Muslim women's retreat. It was an absolutely stunning place. It was a very long drive, but yeah, really lovely. And I did some morning yoga classes for like a mixed ability group. And again, it was really nice for me because it was the first time I got to connect yoga with I guess Islamic spirituality, and that was really special. As well as the yoga sessions, I also did an earthing and meditation session. So like invited people to walk on the grass and bare feet and meditate. And for a lot of people, they've not meditated before, so it's kind of an unusual experience. And so that was really beautiful as well. And I think there's something really beautiful, as I'm sure you agree, like to do yoga in nature and in a beautiful places was like really nice. And yeah, like it was just really nice for people for people to share their experiences with me. Like for some people, it was like a really, really spiritual experience. And sometimes like in my head, I sort of discounted it. It was just like 1 hour yoga class. Well, yeah, I did 1 hour each day. And like, oh yeah, that's my contribution. But then for people to come to me and say, actually, that was a really spiritual experience, or wow, I've never done that before, or actually, ooh, it was nice to try meditation for the first time, or whatever else. And I was like, that's really special. Yeah, so that's me dabbling in different environments and trying to figure out what direction I want to go in. But it's definitely something I want to build on and pursue. Yeah, and kind of link up all my interests around sort of community and spirituality and creating spaces for women and female empowerment and yeah, all of that sort of good stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, sounds like the retreat was very special, and I love that you're exploring different things to see like what resonate with you and what direction you wanna take in future. So I love to know, like, what do you think is your next step or next plan in terms of your yoga teaching?
Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like I can go in a lot of directions. But I think, as I say, the world of business is very new to me, even though, like I say, I studied it. I think I do have a natural entrepreneurial spirit. Whether I can channel that in the right way is will be interesting. But yeah, there's something about thinking about how I can expand that side of that the sort of yoga as a business, or just at least in a way that allows me to generate some income for living or whatever else. So there's something around that, but actually at this stage of my path, I suppose, just like you've said, I'm dabbling in various things, and I think there's something about, and I'm sure not that I'm an artist, but like with artists, like they often say that when you start to monetize things, you can like easily lose your passion for it, or like you might get pulled into certain spaces that maybe don't align with your values, so you might lose that kind of spirit or whatever. So I'm very conscious of not trying to monetize it too much to begin with, although that's absolutely important, and I think it's really important as yoga instructors to put value the contributions that we're making actually to people's lives. But yeah, there's something about taking that journey really slowly and seeing what fits best. I think my biggest ambition and like my dream is, as I say, for me, it's about creating a space. So my dream is one day to have my own space,
Mm.
to connect women, to create spaces where women can like dig deep in whichever way, whether it's yoga or maybe, I could partner up with other practitioners. And there's just, yeah, there's something about creating a space. In dreamland, it would be on a beach somewhere warm and beautiful. But like in the short term, if there's something that there's some, maybe there's an opportunity that might land on my lap where, I could create a space in London or wherever else. And I think the key thing for me, and this is the challenge, isn't it, in a capitalistic world, is making it inclusive because, we all have bills to pay and, taxes and whatever else. But yeah, there's something about creating an inclusive space, one that really is genuinely inclusive for every type of woman and person. So yeah, that's the big dream.
Thank you. Yes. It's so challenging, I find, and kind of listening to you as well. Doing something you're really passionate about and monetizing, because obviously we live in capitalism and we need to earn money somehow, but also we want to make it inclusive and accessible. I'm always struggling with that balance, especially like past few years. How can I make it accessible and inclusive, but also make money from it? Because ideally I would love to not having to work for corporate environments and be my own boss and and create impact.
The
And
dream.
yeah, that would be, and I think we are on the same page, like that's a dream. So I really hear your your passion, but also the challenge that comes with it. I can talk to you forever, and I love really listening to your journey and your story and your experiences. But I'd like to ask you final questions. And one question that I didn't get to ask is, have you had any role model or mentor that you worked with or you admire? And the kind of follow-up question on that is, what was the best advice you've ever received?
So I think growing up, I've not really had like a very distinct role model. Like there's some people who can reel off names. I've never been that sort of person who has that really particular role model. But I think any woman in my life or any woman that I've met who's been like fierce and bold and a risk taker, I've just naturally been drawn to them. Yeah, that kind of fiery spirit. So I think any woman, yeah. So I've got, there's a few people in my life. So when I was young, my older cousin was just like really sassy and bold and opinionated, and I absolutely love that. Then I have my auntie in Iraq, my dad's sister, and she has been through a lot of trials and tribulations and challenges and things, but she is like resilient and she's excelled in her field. So she like works in the pharmaceutical industry. She's excelled in her field in a male dominated world, and again, like just naturally, I just love her for that. Like I look up to her so much. So yeah, I think there's like individuals like that have just kind of influenced my life and sort of inspired me. In terms of a quote, so my auntie in Iraq, she's called Zainab. So I visited Iraq a few years ago. This was kind of just before my sabbatical, kind of going into that kind of spiritual pursuit and trying to figure out who I am and what I wanted. I traveled to Iraq on my own for the first time. Usually I would go with family, and so it's quite energetic and there's lots of people around. You don't really get that one-to-one time. But when I went to visit her and she took me around and we had sort of unique experiences, we'd stay up to like 3 a.m. having these amazing conversations or whatever else. And sometimes I'd step out and we'd be going somewhere and I'd be like, oh, how should I dress, or like how should I be, or whatever. And it sounds very simple, but she sort of said to me, be yourself. And she was always like, be yourself. And I was like, okay. And she said it a lot during that trip. It was only 2 weeks and she'd say it a lot. And it just, I think as an adult, that hits really different. Like when you're a child and you're growing up, you hear that all the time. But it hits different when someone points out to you, like, why are you even questioning how you should be? Just be yourself. Yeah, I was like, okay, yeah, why am I not myself? Like there is something here, like why do I have to like adjust and be palatable to people? And I've carried that with me for the past few years. And I think that's kind of, just shaped the time since. Like my big theme now in life is to be unapologetic, like unapologetically me. And it's hard, it's challenging, but I'm trying to do it in all facets of my life, whether it's work or other places. It's like, and so like that be yourself is like, it's really simple but powerful when it clicks for you.
Thank you. Yeah, I love your auntie. Sorry, auntie. Yeah, sounds like she's an incredible person. But yeah, like you just said as well, like I was thinking, like as I was listening to you saying be yourself, it's such a simple phrase. But yeah, like we don't really think about that. Like, and I think we probably know, like, unconsciously maybe, but like we're not actually practicing that. I love that your theme of being unapologetically you. And yeah, I do think that that's how everyone, should be.
There is one, sorry, if I can share, there's a quote that I really love, that kind of links to that. So it's one of my favorite books I've read twice in like the space of a year. And if you're my friend, you'll know that I recommend this like most days. So it's called 4,000 Weeks. The The Mortal's Guide to Time Management. I won't go into too much detail about the book, but there's lots of like reflection questions at the end. I don't know if this is going to hit because I've not really given that much context, but one of the questions at the end is like, in what ways have you yet to accept the fact that you are who you are, not the person you think you ought to be?
Yes, love that. And I think I've heard, sorry, I was going to say, I think I've heard about that book. I'm sure someone was telling me.
It was probably me.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, maybe. Yeah, but I'm sure I heard about that book. Can you repeat that reflective question again? The one that you just said?
So, in what ways have you yet to accept the fact that you are who you are, not the person you think you ought to be?
Yes, I'll journal on that today.
Love it.
Thank you. I got a couple of more questions I wanted to ask. So, what advice would you give to those who are trying to follow their passion but feeling challenged to do so?
I think for me, my biggest struggle is prioritization. I get really easily distracted and I can take on like 10 different projects at one time. And I think one of the biggest game changers has been, prioritization. Actually, this goes back to the book. I was going to mention this book, to the 4,000 Weeks. The premise of the book is that we have, on average, we live at an average of 4,000 weeks, and that scares people immediately. And I think that's the point. And the sooner we come to accept our finite nature as human beings in our lives, the more we will be at peace, and the more we will realize that we can't do everything. Even the things that we want to do, we can't do everything. So if I now listed, and I do this often, I list all the things I want to achieve and my priorities and things, you might get a list of 10, 20 things. And sometimes you have to look at that list and be like, I can't do all of it. You just look at it and you accept, I can't do all of it. So I'm going to pick 3 or 4 things. So I think that really, again, it's about being intentional. It's about going back to that list. I do it sort of every month or so, and I look back at that list, put it on my notes section on my phone, say, okay, do I want to reshuffle my priority, or am I going to stick with these 3 or 4 things? So it's been really helpful for someone who really struggles with that sort of thing. And I think another thing is listen. Well, as yogis, I think one thing that we've sort of practiced is like listening to your body in terms of like, is there any tension when you're working a particular job or doing something that you feel like you have to do? Or I think we need to tune into that, what our body is telling us and what our emotional state is telling us. So many times we just kind of bury it under the rug and think it's going to go away, but actually it's a sign that we need to do something. And so that like I say, that feeling isn't going to disappear. So deal with it and take that one step. All you need to do is take that one step and things will start to fall into place.
Thank you. I love that advice. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so if people want to get in touch with you after listening to your journey and your incredible advice, where can people find you?
Yeah, so I have my yoga account on Instagram. So if you want to follow, it's yoga _Ruru. So Ruru is RURU. So yeah, it'd be lovely to connect. And yeah.
Amazing. I will make sure to link that in the show notes. Well, thank you so much, Ronak. It's been inspiring, and yeah, I feel like I've learned so much about yourself, but also all the wisdom that you just shared in this episode. It's just been amazing. So thank you so much. And yeah, have a lovely day and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you, Risa. I appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed listening to my conversation with Ronak as much as I did. It was really inspiring to hear her journey and her passion for yoga, spirituality, and creating genuinely inclusive spaces for every type of woman. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and leave a review so we can reach as many people as possible. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next episode.